Music by Parry, taken from a brand new recording of Prometheus Unbound, released today on the Chandos label. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and welcome to this week's podcast, which I'm delighted to say is once again being produced in association with Wigmore Hall, the world-famous London music venue, where this week you can hear artists including sopranos Carolyn Sampson and Ruby Hughes, pianist Elizabeth Leonskaya, the Mozartists, and much more. Stay tuned after the podcast for a full rundown of this week's events. Prometheus Unbound is a wonderful, large-scale but largely neglected work by the English composer Parry. Neglected, that is, until now. William Vann has made a superb recording of it, and we've named it our Recording of the Month in the October issue of Gramophone. I caught up with the conductor to find out more. William, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Now let's begin by simply saying a little bit more about what this work is. Written by Parry when 32 for the Three Choirs Festival in Gloucester, premiered in 1880, it draws on Shelley's four-act lyrical drama Prometheus Unbound, the same title, of 1820, itself based on a Greek tragedy. So tell us a little bit about the work, why Parry wrote it and why he particularly was drawn to Shelley's work.
Absolutely. Well, he received this commission, and I think, obviously in the great tradition of writing pieces for something like the Three Choirs Festival, you would have expected him to choose maybe a big religious text, which actually he did later on with something like his Oratorio Judith. But for this first foray, he seems to have really gone for something secular. And I think the reason he chose this text is its closeness to the subject matter of the ring cycle. He'd just been to hear that very recently, just before writing this. He knew his Wagner really well. And the sort of theme of humanity rising up, overthrowing its gods, overthrowing the shackles of the gods, really, I suppose, and finding a new harmonious existence through the perfection of love, was something that really appealed to him as someone who wasn't actually particularly religious. So I think he would have struggled maybe more to write a sort of a purely religious, large-scale work at this stage, particularly in his output. So I think that's why he goes for it. It sort of strikes a chord with him spiritually, but also musically through its proximity to the Wagnerian tradition.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot here slightly. And can you just distill the story, as it were, the Greek tragedy?
Yeah, exactly. Well, obviously, he by its very nature, he had to cut Shelley's poem, drastically, and so we get really a kind of a very, very bare bones outline of it in the piece. But at the beginning, we see Prometheus chained to the rock. Of course, as we all know, this is the bit we know, of course, well from the story of Prometheus daily being attacked by birds who would sort of peck out his inner organs. Pretty horrible form of torture, which was repeated every day, and he would sort of continue living while this happened. So at the beginning, he's in this sort of awful situation, bound in chains, and Mercury visits him. And tells him, he knows that Prometheus has a secret. In fact, Jupiter, the king of the gods, knows that Prometheus has a secret of who will overthrow Jupiter as the king of the gods. And Mercury says, to Prometheus, if you tell me this secret, I will release you. But Prometheus says, no, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you who will do this. This is private information, and of course is critical to the whole unfolding of the story. So Mercury, who's actually pained by this, this is the tenor role of Mercury, as opposed to Prometheus, the bass role in this piece. Mercury says, I'm so sad, but I have to leave you to your torment, which then continues with the chorus of Furies, so a big chorus number, which is one of the sort of most dramatic parts of the piece, I suppose. So they come and they torture Prometheus once more. So that's your kind of opening scene. This is in a lot of detail, actually, more than I expected. But it's a great story, and it's very vivid. And you can see why Parry was drawn to it. Because then we have the character of Mother Earth, comes on the scene next, and that's this beautiful mezzo-soprano solo. I felt thy torture, son, she sings, and she comforts Prometheus. And really, we then have this story of how Prometheus is suffering, but for the good of humanity. Next, we go to Jupiter on his throne, and this is the tenor, of course. So hubris is the word used to describe his his demeanour. So he's triumphant on his throne, but he, of course, knows there's this thing that can overthrow him. And during the middle of this scene, this thing appears. It turns out to be Jupiter's own child that overthrows him and takes him down to hell. So swallows him up. So there's this extraordinary scene with Jupiter, I suppose, which is incredibly dramatic, starts incredibly triumphant, but then ends up with him being overthrown. And then the final scene, we're towards the end of Shelley's work now. There are various choruses singing of what's happened, how humanity is going to be free, how we're going to live in this new world of freedom from tyranny, really, I suppose, and release. And it finishes with this huge celebratory chorus. So it's an incredible work of freedom that does have parallels with that Wagnerian ring.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, I think certainly that should encourage many people to be intrigued to want to hear how Parry sets it to music. But also, I think that really helps set it in the sort of social and cultural and philosophical context of the time, and why Parry was drawn to this, why he wanted to set it. And yet, what we do know is that it wasn't terribly well received initially. It wasn't universally admired, although a year after its premiere, Stanford conducted a further performance, this time in Cambridge. The fact that Stanford took that on as an affirmation of its quality, which he then followed up a year later. So it did have a period of triumph, although by the end of the decade it got completely neglected again. But what accounts for that first initial coolness, then a bit of attention, and then complete neglect, really, until, well, only a few decades ago it got another performance, and now, of course, this wonderful recording now.
No, absolutely. It's extraordinary how this can happen, really. But then, of course, we have to remember there are so many works out there that we've forgotten about by composers we don't even know about. Really, these days, when you open an old second-hand vocal score of an oratorio and you look at the back, it's astonishing seeing all these works that you've never even heard of, and as I say, sometimes by composers you've never heard of as well. But with this specific piece, I think certainly the first performance was a bit of a disaster by all accounts. Right. There were problems with the scores. The orchestral scores had loads of mistakes in them. The vocal scores themselves were sort of like part book scores. They only had one vocal line in, so the singers couldn't see what was happening anywhere else in the texture, which is perhaps not ideal. As a choral singer, you normally want to at least refer to something else that's going on. Yeah. So the chorus really struggled. They had to have lots and lots of extra rehearsal until late in the night before the first performance, which can't have been great either. And as I said, the orchestral parts were a bit of a shambles as well. So by all accounts, that first performance didn't go very well. And that's not the only work that's happened to in musical history, is it? But I think that definitely made it difficult to get a sort of initial momentum. But then, as you say, Stanford, after having, I think it was after the vocal score was published by Novello, because Parry also had difficulty publishing it at first. He took it to his favourite publisher, who said no, and then Novello's took it on. Once there was a good vocal score published, I think obviously that makes it more easy to perform something, because you got the material there. And Stanford seems to have responded, really positively to the work. He thought it was great. He told Parry as much. And the performance in Cambridge seems to have been really, really triumphant. As you say, really positively received, so much that it was then went to London, and then there were a few other performances. In the following years, I suppose, by then, there were other new big choral works coming out, and Parry, obviously, I think Parry himself didn't really push his music much himself. Time-wise, his work often got swallowed up with running the Royal College of Music. We know that. And actually, he didn't have as much time to compose as he wanted, let alone then, champion his own works. And he wasn't like some composers, willing to stand up in front of the orchestra all the time and be the conductor as well, which, could have given, he could have maybe made himself a bit more of a vehicle for his own work. So whilst he was still writing other things, that maybe those other things became the latest thing of the day. Then, of course, Elgar took over the mantle of kind of the man of the moment in English oratorio writing, as we know, in the later part of the 19th century. And really, by the time Parry dies in 1918, a lot of his music has fallen out of favour, apart from a few kind of slightly small-scale choral works. It's a bit sad, in many ways, because you think it must have hurt him to some extent to feel this sort of neglect that was there even before he dies. And then afterwards, of course, the fashions changed, and the works of composers like Vaughan Williams-Holst, that sort of style, more modern style, became the thing that people wanted to listen to. So I think in a way it's great now, because we're at a moment where we've had all that. We can look back at this music and really see it for what it is, and not be embarrassed about it, about its sort of Englishness or Victorianness, which is there to some extent, certainly, but on the other hand, celebrate the things which are amazing about it, and there are a lot.
Alas, me, pain ever forever, no change, no pause, no.
You've talked a little bit about its style and perhaps going out of style, but where would you place it musically? And there are references to the Wagnerian sound world and also the Wagnerian thematic world. It also draws on the oratorio tradition in many sort of ways. Does it feel like a work of its time, a progressive work, something part of trends and movements you can see of that time, or perhaps something unique and individual?
I think it certainly picks up on this Wagnerian thread, but it's not by no means, it's not just a piece of Wagnerian pastiche at all. It's something much different. It's the orchestration is very, very innovative and really fascinating, and really stands out among all English music at the time. And that was noted even at the time, even among some less favourable reviews. One thing they all spotted was how inventive Parry was being and how new he was being. So actually it is a really new work in terms of style. It also starts, you hear some germs of Parry's own distinctive style, which is a sort of melding of some English traditions and some Germanic traditions. That's starting to emerge. And you have plenty of Wagner there, but you also have quite a bit of Mendelssohn, I think. There's sort of hints of Brahms as well. Schumann, interestingly, someone was saying to me the other day, it was something that that springs out of the music a little bit as well. So it's all sorts of things that Parry's putting together. It's still a fairly early work, of his, really, when he was 32, and we have a long way to go before he's kind of really cemented that style, which perhaps Blessed Pair of Sirens is a really good example of that kind of incredibly accomplished. Accomplished Parry voice, so I think it's really fascinating. I think people at the time noticed that it was something new. I think Parry was doing something new, and we can appreciate that now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And lots of Parry's music isn't as well known as it might be, though. It has had its champions. One of them, no less, is His Majesty the King, on whose anniversary of his accession to the throne we're indeed talking today. So it'd be lovely to think that a copy of this might have found its way onto his headphones.
Yeah, I hope so. I think we sent one.
There we are. I mean, it's beautifully recorded with a wonderful lineup of musicians, from soloists Sarah Fox, Sarah Connolly, David Butt Phillip, Neil Davies, to the chorus, the Crouch End Festival chorus, to the instrumentalists, the London Mozart players. And the sound is splendid. So tell me about the thought that went into the casting, as it were, and the recording itself.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because partly because these solos, I think let's start with the solos, are tough. They're big sings. They require fantastic singers at the peak of their powers who have really good projection. Big voices is a sort of dangerous word, isn't it? But certainly, powerful voices. And actually, I must say I was really, really lucky. All 4 of those soloists I went to, I think, were my first choice, and they all said yes, which is brilliant, and it hardly ever happens. and I was so pleased, and they're all so well suited to the roles. So, but I think power and presence, and also ability to project drama is really important. They've all got voices capable of hugely intense drama. So you've got obviously Neil, who's fantastic Prometheus, and I knew he'd be really well suited for that just looking at the part. The tenor part as well, David Butt-Philip. I mean, that's he not only had to do this sort of magnificent character of Jupiter. He also had to do the slightly more kind of delicate and warm character of Mercury. So to have someone who can pull off those 2 characters, you could imagine casting it with 2 voices, but actually he does both so well.
And sounds distinct in both characters,
yeah,
which is so important.
Exactly. So he really got that kind of that contrast, and that came across in the sessions as well. And then Sarah Connolly, obviously, I mean, it's just a delight to have her singing this Mother Earth, and then a beautiful solo section that heralds an astonishing quartet, which is kind of one of the highlights of the piece actually later on, which starts Fair Are Others. And then Sarah Fox, of course, who was the soprano soloist on Judith that I recorded a few years ago, and her voice suits that music so well. It's absolutely fantastic. And the spirit of the hour is really, she's got one solo moment, but it's stunning. But again, it's not an easy sing. And that's perhaps another little, hint of why this music may have also fallen out of favour a bit. It's not easy. And the 4 soloists who sang, certainly in Cambridge, I know who the 4 were for that. They're all, fantastic, well-known soloists who were known for their, at the bass, for example, Frederick King doing Elijah. But I guess maybe if they couldn't be found, I mean, who else would sing this? I don't know. Maybe there weren't so many people who could do that. And that may have made it harder to put on performances, perhaps, than, say, a Messiah, where, you can get almost anyone to sing it and it will work. Now, onto the other forces, I mean, having worked with London Mozart players and Crouch End Festival Chorus before on Judith, I knew that we had a great group there that worked really well. The chorus and the orchestra worked really well together. Simon, who led the orchestra Simon from the London Mozart players, Simon Blendis, was a fantastic colleague to work with. And he was, that relationship between conductor and leader is so important to get right. And we've done a couple of things before, actually. So I knew that would work really well. Actually, I have to say huge thanks to David Temple from Crouch End Festival Chorus, who leads an extraordinary choir there. I mean, they're brilliant. And I think one of the best things about them is that you never lose a word of the text. So, which in a poem like this, that's really good literature, it would be a shame to lose any of the words. So it's really good to have that. But they also make a fantastic sound. Yeah,
it all sounds so perfectly well balanced by your conducting, by the engineering, but also by the extraordinary acoustic of St Jude's on the Hill, Hampstead Garden suburb.
Yeah, exactly. That we recorded under the dome there, which is lovely. So you get a little bit of the bloom on the sound, which I think the engineers quite like, which is great. You've also, of course, got a really nice organ there, and James Orford, who played organ for this, that was an important part of it, because actually these big final choruses, or Blessed Pair of Sirens as well, really benefit from that sort of extra roar that the organ can give at the end. And I think the thrill of hearing that in there made me realise that it was really the right decision to record it somewhere with a good organ.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Blessed Pair of Sirens, and that's a lovely, generous extra part of the album. That work did go on to have a successful life, and to become one of the most popular pieces of English choral music of its era.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, but perhaps it's just practicality, perhaps a performance. There you've got a work for double chorus and orchestra with organ, but potentially just organ on its own. So of course, actually, it's a piece that English cathedrals and choirs, church choirs, have sung since then, and it's maintained its place in the repertoire alongside works like I Was Glad as well, and lots of other works of its time by Stanford, and so really it's these bigger works by those composers that have sort of fallen by the wayside, whereas of course the strength of the English church music tradition has meant that those anthems have survived. Although Blessed Pair of Sirens is a big anthem to sing in an evensong.
It is big. It's about 9-10 minutes with large forces, but yes, no,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that leads us on perhaps to a final word about you, if we may. You're a dedicated champion of neglected English music, of which this Parry recording is a perfect example. So tell me where and why this particular passion came about.
Yeah, well, I've felt it for a long time, really. I was a chorister as a boy at King's Cambridge with Stephen Clearbury there, and that was a sort of very strong formative experience for me musically. So really from then onwards, I felt this kind of very strong affinity with the church music tradition, which has continued as a thread throughout my career, even as I've delved into other areas such as my company career and orchestral conducting as well. So that's something I keep coming back to, I suppose. And a composer like Parry is so central to that, as we've just discussed, really, with those anthems that we all know and love. That really I was fascinated to find out more about the rest of his output. I mean, this is Parry specifically, but actually in general, I think English music, I'm interested when it's something that hasn't been heard. Sometimes you look at it and you think, actually, there's a very good reason. But at other times, you look at a piece of music and you think, gosh, this is incredible that this hasn't been done for so long or not recorded. I first found that with Judith, really, which I approached from the perspective of knowing the hymn, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, and always seeing at the top of the hymn book from the Oratorio Judith. And it always been at the back of my mind, what is this oratorio? And has it been recorded? No. Where can I find out more about it? And that really led to that big revival project, performance and recording. And off the back of that, I suppose, I was thinking, what else don't I know about Parry? Clearly there's a great composing mind in there who's also capable of composing large-scale pieces, as well as the smaller scale things that I knew as a child. And really it was talking to Jeremy Dibble, I think, more than anything else, obviously, leading expert in Parry's music. And he sort of gently pointed me in the direction of a few things. But with this project, Prometheus kept leaping up at me as a fascinating piece, partly because of its history and its importance in the development of English music, English choral music particularly, and with orchestra. So I did more reading around, and I think with all these things, that a really important first step is to hear the piece, even in a small scale way. So I assembled a group of colleagues, of singing colleagues, and I gave them all dinner in return for singing through Prometheus, and also giving me their thoughts, which I thought was really important as well. Just to know it's not just you on some some absolute bonkers foray into the that's into a piece that's actually a complete dead end. And actually, really interesting, those 9 singers all turned around at the end and said, this is really good. This is really good music. How has it not been recorded? And yeah, great. I mean, they sort of, a bit of collective blessing, but it's nice to feel that other people, feel the same way about it.
No, absolutely. And it would be absolutely lovely to think it might now start having a renewed performance life.
I really hope so. And one of the critical things for that will obviously be having the performance material. We've obviously created a lot of that. Jeremy Dibble did some incredible work reconstructing the full score in parts, but also plugging them all into Sibelius. So we created a new digital as well as physical library of the parts, which I think will be really important. It'd be nice to have those sort of more formally published at some point, but certainly the resources are there now, which is really important. So if anyone comes to me and says, I'd like to perform it, I'd say, great.
Yeah, and a recording which they could now hear, listen to, and learn the work through that.
Exactly,
well.
yeah.
So just a reminder that Parry's Prometheus Unbound, conducted by my guest today, William Vann, with the London Mozart Players, the Crouch End Festival Chorus, and a superb lineup of soloists, is available now on the Chandos label and is our recording of the month in the October issue of Gramophone. It is a superb album. I do urge you to listen to it. William Vann, thank you so much for joining me today.
Huge pleasure, thank you.
Chorus that concludes Parry's Prometheus Unbound, and my thanks again to William Vann for talking to us about the work, which is our new Gramophone recording of the month. This week's Gramophone podcast is published in association with Wigmore Hall, where this week, on Saturday, September the 16th, you can hear soprano Ruby Hughes and the United Strings of Europe perform an hour-long programme called Inheriting the Earth. That evening at 7:30, the 12 Ensemble perform works by Anna Klein, Oliver Leaf, Schoenberg and Claude Vivier. Sunday the 17th at 11:30 in the morning sees trio Shaham Eros Waldfisch perform Beethoven and Ravel, while at 7:30 pianist Elizabeth Leonskaya offers Brahms's 3 piano sonatas. On Monday at 1 p.m, violinist Chuchon Sionossian, harpsichordist Leonardo Garcia Alonso and cellist Belesh Mate take to the stage, followed at 7:30 by the Schumann Quartet. Join the Mozartists and their conductor Ian Page on Tuesday evening, while on Wednesday lunchtime you can hear some of today's finest young singers in the Wigmore French Song Exchange. Brad Meldau is that evening's artist, followed on Thursday evening by soprano Carolyn Sampson and friends. Finally, on Friday, bass Gunter Grossbock and pianist Malcolm Martineau bring Wigmore's week to a close with works by Beethoven, Schumann, Brahms and Tchaikovsky. For full details of all these concerts, visit wigmore-hall.org.uk. Just a reminder that if you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more episodes by searching for Gramophone wherever you get your podcasts. Please do tell your friends, and would be hugely grateful if you could leave a rating or a review or hit the subscribe button. And if you want to explore classical music in even greater depth with Gramophone, then we produce a monthly magazine packed full of interviews, features and reviews, and all listeners to this podcast can get a 20% discount by visiting gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and entering podcast 20 at the checkout. Thank you for listening, and do join us again for another Gramophone podcast next week.